my name is Julia Sakura, but you can also find me on Slack as Miwa. And in this class, I will talk about microservice architecture. Hopefully, by the end of today's class, you will understand what is a microservice architecture and the main difference between microservice and a monolithic architecture. Also, I will try to explain the best practice in microservice as well as their benefits and drawbacks in the context of e-commerce systems. Well, it's probably easier to understand what is not a microservice architecture, a monolith. Before microservice, the standard way of developing application was with a monolithic architecture, which means all the components of the whole code are part of a single unit of the application, all assembled together and tightly packaged, making them all interconnected and interdependent. So, for example, an online shop application, all of its parts, like the user authentication, shopping cart, product catalog, and so on, will be in one code base as part of one monolithic architecture. Everything is developed, deployed, and scaled as one unit. This means that the application must be written in one single language with one technology stack with a single runtime. And if you have different teams working on different parts of the application, they will need to coordinate to make sure they don't affect on each other's work. Also, if developers change code for the payment functionality, for instance, you will need to build the whole application and deploy it as one package. You can just update and deploy this part of the code separately. So it might start simple, but over time, you might add new endpoints, new databases table, and eventually you will have just one giant code base that does everything. And this will lead to different challenges. First of all, complexity. The bigger the code, the more complex it is to understand and modify such tangled applications, as well as the coordination between teams gets even harder. And for changes in any part of the app, you will need to test and build the whole application to deploy the changes in a feature, making the development really slow and difficult to have frequent deployments. Also, if you suddenly have a usage spike in shopping cart, for example, on holiday dates, you will not be able to scale only that specific service of the app. You will need to scale the whole application. And this means higher infrastructure costs and less flexibility in scaling. Additionally, if one of the service goes down, the entire system will fail to run. So, for instance, if my payments module fails, that will lead to the downfall of my entire app because all the modules are running within the same process. So a bug in any module can potentially bring down the entire process. This makes monolithic architecture highly unstable and unreliable. And finally, inflexibility. The monolithic architecture makes really difficult to adopt new frameworks and languages. Suppose you have million lines of code written with YXZ framework, and it would be extremely expensive in terms of time and cost to rewrite the entire application in a newer framework, even if said framework was considerably better. So there is a huge barrier to adopting new technologies. And for these issues comes the microservice architecture to solve them. So what is exactly a microservice architecture? Microservice architecture is an architectural style that structures an application as a collection of small autonomous service modeled around a business domain. In simpler terms, in microservice, each service is self-contained and implements a single business capability. Basically, the most important thing to understand is that each service operates independently. We can deploy changes to one service while the others continue running. They could each run on different machines, which can scale independently. And it's also easier to identify if one service is using lots of CPU, for example, and if one service fails, the others can still handle requests as normal. And each service uses its own database, which has similar benefits to independent services. They can each fail without taking other databases down, and they can scale independently. And how do we split those services? And how many service do we create? How big or small should they be? Well, first of all, the best practice is to break down the application into components or into microservice based on business rather than technical functionalities. So taking the example of the e-commerce, you could have user authentication and shopping cart and so on. And in terms of size, each service must do just one specific job. And as I said, a very important characteristic of each microservice is that they should be self-contained and independent from each other, which means each service must be able to be developed, deployed, and scaled separately. This guarantees a looser coupling of the system's components and how each microservice communicates with each other. Overall, they can communicate through API calls in a synchronous way, where each service has its own endpoints and they talk to each other through HTTP requests. And another common way is by an asynchronous communications via message broker. Wrapping it up, as you can see, microservice architecture has many benefits compared to the former monolithic type. And the key advantage is that it's way easier and faster to maintain and update your microservice. If you need to change the code, if you need to implement new features, for example, a 2.3 version of the checkout, you can still have a 1.8 version of the catalog module. You won't need to rewrite the entire application. You just need to deploy that one specific checkout service, making it much more stable. And because of that, microservices allow a granular scalability where service can be scaled independently. So if I need to scale up the card service, then I can just scale up the card service instead of scaling up the entire application. Another benefit is flexibility. In monolithic architecture, the app needs to be written in a single language, while in microservice, you can have some modules in Python for fast deployment, and at the same time, some others can be written in Java for its speed and extensive libraries. We have to keep in mind that alongside the advantage, microservices introduce some other challenges as well. One of the main downside is the complexity of configuring the communication between services, because a microservice may be down or unhealthy and not responding well. And when another service starts sending their request to its API, you may get unexpected results. Also, networks calls are much slower than the inter-process communication in a monolithic architecture, and it usually involves writing a lot more codes to handle the call. You gotta be careful also when separating the service and their sizes, because a common mistake is to make service too small, known as nano service. This can work for some service, but we should also and always be careful not to make service that depend too much on each other. So tightly coupled service means multiple service would need changing to achieve most tests, which defeats the whole point, right? And with that, you would actually be creating some sort of distributed monolith. And so for that, developers are incentivized not to rely on passing information between boundaries too much, and instead build loosely coupled subsystems that don't depend on each other to function. And before, with the monolithic architecture, if one service is not operating, you would know, because everything else would also not be operating, right? Whereas in microservice, you will need a monitoring system to identify and keep track of the multiple servers that may or may not be operating properly across different servers. Luckily today, there are many tools available and many more are being developed to tackle this task. And that's it for now. I hope that now you can answer what is a microservice architecture and its main benefits and drawbacks in the e-commerce context. I will leave the material I used by the end of the video, and feel free to contact me anytime you like. See you around. Bye-bye.